right, welcome everyone to June's Age Well series event titled The Science of Purpose, How Meaning Supports Health and Well-Being. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Erin Eggert, the Deputy Director here at the Wisconsin Institute for Healthy Aging. WIHA is an organization whose mission is to improve the health and well-being of all people as we age. So we encourage you each to sign up for our newsletter if you have not already, and to check out our programs or the programs and initiatives on our website as well. Just a few housekeeping pieces before we get started. All participants will be muted and have their cameras off during this presentation. The webinar will be recorded and an email will be sent out to all registered participants after the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat box to submit any questions. We will have time for Q&A at the end of our presentation today. I'll now introduce our speaker, Dr. Stacy Schaefer from the University of Wisconsin Institute on Aging. Dr. Schaefer's research is on the emotional determinants of health and well-being and has a goal of gaining a better understanding of how emotional, social, and biological processes interact to impact well-being and health outcomes across the lifespan. Dr. Schaefer, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you all letting me be here. Right now it says, let me try sharing one more time. Oh, there we go. All right, are you seeing what you should see? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for having me today. I want to share a little bit about who I am and some of our research findings today, and then we'll get to eventually how you can actually try to improve your own purpose and meaning in life. So a little bit about who's talking to you today. I am a researcher at the UW in Madison, but I'm also a mom, a wife, daughter, sister, friend. I love animals. I have 2 dogs, 2 cats, 4 birds, and I volunteer at an animal shelter. I garden. I grow a lot of fruits and nuts and native plants on Whitney Way, actually, in Madison. And of course, I'm a scientist and a mentor and a supervisor. And you can see some of the undergraduates who celebrated the end of the semester with our researchers here in my lab, pictured here. So a little bit about my background. I actually am from a small town in Wisconsin called Hustisford. It's kind of near Horicon, if you're familiar with that, or Hartford. And I came to UW-Madison and got a bachelor's in psychology and zoology, went to the East Coast to Philadelphia to get a PhD in psychology with a specialization in cognitive neuroscience, came back home to Madison to do a postdoc in affective neuroscience, and have gradually transitioned since coming back here to lead studies from a neuroscience perspective, looking at the socio-emotional determinants of health, well-being, and aging. And one of those studies in particular is MIDAS. So MIDAS, I'm going to share a lot of findings today from MIDAS and other studies, but so it's kind of worth highlighting what MIDAS is, since it's really an important study that's kind of led here at UW-Madison. So MIDAS stands for Midlife in the US, and it's a national longitudinal study that celebrated its 30th anniversary last year. So it's been going on long before I became part of it, but I've been part of it now for 16 years, I think. So it's a study that has a lot of collaborators from different disciplines, from sociology, demography, neuroscience, psychology, genetics, and people share their relative expertise to really combine what we can learn about people as they age and what contributes to health and well-being, starting from your 25s to your hundreds. So we get a lot of different information from the same participants and combine that information to really understand what are the risk and resilience factors in aging. The study began in 1995, and at that point, they randomly called, when people had landlines and answered their phones, they called over 7,000 people around the US. And over 7,000 people participated and answered a lot of questions to give us a lot of information about themselves. And the sample at that point was age 25 to 74, so 5 decades of age range. Those same people have now been followed up in the 2000s in what we call the MIDAS 2. They were followed up again from 2017 to 2022 for what we call MIDAS 3. And we're now actually following them up again for what we call their 4th wave in MIDAS 4. And because that sample has obviously aged over 30 years and are now 55 to 100 plus, we brought in a new group of people, again, randomly called throughout the nation in the 2010s, and they were called the refresher sample. When they came into the study, they were again between the ages of 25 to 75. So we combined them with that original sample, with the refresher sample, and we selectively recruited a lot of Black Americans from Milwaukee to increase the representation in our study. But also, you may not be aware, I wasn't aware until I worked on MIDAS, that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the US, according to the Brookings Institute. So there is a lot we can learn about what different life experiences can contribute to in terms of healthy aging and resilience versus vulnerability to disease. So across all of these samples together, we now have a large group of people between the ages of 35 to 100 plus that we are following over time with repeated assessments to really learn how we can all age better. And importantly, all the data we collect, we make publicly available. So people around the world are asking questions of the data set to learn more. And at this point, there's over 2,300 publications from MIDAS, so a lot of important findings. And today, I'm just going to share with you a tiny, tiny little bit of some new findings we have from my lab, but also other people, and some important findings, honestly, when it comes to purpose and meaning in life that come from other studies, because it is a very, very large area. There's a lot of research out there saying that purpose is important. So what is purpose in life? You might have an idea, but what we define it as feeling that one's life has meaning and having goals, intentions, and a sense of directions for one life. And there are a lot of philosophers and theorists who have talked about purpose in life, but one of the most important and well-known is probably Viktor Frankl, who said, "He who has a way to live can bear almost any how." And there's probably quite a few of you who have heard about Viktor Frankl or read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl wrote about meaning and purpose in life. And his premise in this book is that the primary human drive is not seeking pleasure, but actually the discovery and pursuit of what we personally find meaningful. And that meaning is found through creating, experiencing, sharing, or choosing one's attitude towards the inevitable suffering that we experience with life, because we all die, the people we love all die, so life is going to have suffering. But life asks us to be responsible in some way, and we can find meaning by answering that call and coping with our suffering. And it's especially profound when you know Viktor Frankl's history. So Viktor Frankl wrote about meaning in life before he was a concentration camp prisoner during the Holocaust. And he actually used his theorizing about meaning and purpose to help care for his fellow prisoners, as well as in his work after he survived the Holocaust. And he lost his family members in the Holocaust as well. So it's especially profound to hear some of the things he says, such as life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose when you know about his history. So he is a very profound example of how purpose can provide resilience. But there's so much findings in the scientific research literature suggesting and backing up the link between purpose and resilience. And I'm just going to give you a tiny little pinpricks of insight into that. So higher levels of purpose are associated with better mental health, better stress coping and emotion regulation. People who have higher purpose report lower levels of mental health symptoms like loneliness, depression, and anxiety. They report and exhibit healthier lifestyle behaviors. So better adherence to healthier diets, showing better sleep, more physical activity, more social activity, more engagement in cognitive activities. People who have higher purpose in life report better cognition and show in cognitive tests better cognition. And in longitudinal studies like MIDAS, but done actually elsewhere, for example, at Rush in Chicago, you see reduced risk of cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. And I think one of the most magical findings, honestly, in the purpose literature came from some of the work coming out of Rush in Chicago, where they followed the community members longitudinally and saw that those people at higher levels of purpose in life had better ability to take care of themselves, for example, shop and cook for themselves and care for themselves as they get older. They showed less cognitive decline as they got older, less dementia and other issues. But when they did pass away and donated their brains to science, and pathologists looked at their brains, those people had similar levels of Alzheimer's disease pathology, so amyloid and tau in their brains, but who reported higher levels of purpose while alive, had better cognition, even with that pathology in their brain. So there's something magic about well, at least I think it's magic about how purpose seems to protect and even allow better function, even in the presence of Alzheimer's disease. And then there is a lot of data across the world from longitudinal studies showing that purpose is related with a lower risk of cardiovascular events and dying from all causes. So there is less risk of dying if you have higher levels of purpose. And specifically in the MIDAS study, there's another mind-blowing finding where we looked at the sample and followed them over time, and those people had higher levels of purpose, were less likely to be dead at the next follow-up, but it didn't matter what age they were. They could be in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It wasn't as if it was protective only for older folks. It's really protective across the lifespan. So purpose is important. There's clear associated health benefits where people show better health behaviors. They have sharper memory and thinking skills. They show better mood control and stress regulation, reduced risk of chronic diseases and disability, and better longevity. But it's also a better, healthier longevity. People are living longer, healthier, with higher levels of purpose in life. So you might ask, like, how do we assess purpose and meaning in life? That's a pretty abstract, esoteric kind of concept. And we do so using Dr. Carol Riff's scales of psychological well-being. And one of her scales specifically measures purpose in life. So Dr. Carol Riff is the overall leader of the midlife in the US, or MIDAS study that I work on. And she read a lot of philosophers and theorists to basically try to distill a lot of concepts that people have put out there, from Aristotle to Dr. Viktor Frankl to others, to basically find out what are the components of psychological well-being. And she developed questions assessing purpose in life that are widely used and have been widely used now for decades in scientific research. For example, we ask questions like, I live life one day at a time and don't really think about the future. Or I have a sense of direction and purpose in life. Or I don't have a good sense of what it is I'm trying to accomplish in life. Or my daily activities often seem trivial and unimportant to me. Or I enjoy making plans for the future and working to make them a reality. Or I sometimes feel as if I've done all there is to do in life. And people just rate these items from strongly agree to strongly disagree. We reverse score the ones that are negative, and we create a sum. And we use that measure to basically look at their levels of self-reported purpose in life in relation to all other aspects of health and well-being and mortality. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of our kind of new findings about purpose and brain health. Bear with me. It will not be that technical, but we will then, after kind of sharing some of the findings that are new and novel, talk about some ways to promote your own purpose and meaning in life. So when we think about brain health, we often focus in on a structure called the hippocampus. It's here shown in green. It's a brain structure in the temporal lobes, both on the left and right. And it's really critical for learning, memory, emotion, and stress regulation. It's a brain region that's very plastic. It's critical for learning and memory. So it changes as we learn new and make new memories. But it's also really vulnerable to aging and experiences of severe or chronic stress. It is a brain region that's impacted in many neurological and psychiatric disorders. It's also the brain region that has the most evidence suggesting that there is lifelong neurogenesis, or the birth of new neurons, especially in the hippocampus. Even through your 9th decade of life, people, even in their 90s, are showing neurogenesis in the hippocampus. And that neurogenesis is really critically important for making new memories and learning. But that neurogenesis seems to be kind of shut down or inhibited or impaired, for example, in Alzheimer's disease. And this structure is really important given that it's plastic and its structure and size change given on people's experience and with age. So it's often one of the first places we look when we want to investigate brain health and brain aging. So for example, if we look at our MIDAS samples, we see what many other people have seen, where there's an age relationship. So the hippocampal volume appears to decrease with age. And that's true in our sample here from the refresher sample, who are between the ages of 25 to 75. So a 50-year age range. And we see the same relationship in our MIDAS core sample between the ages of 45 to 95. Hippocampal volume decreases with age, but it may not decrease as fast in some people. So when we look at purpose in life in hippocampal volume, in both the refresher, who are on the top, and the core sample, who are on the bottom, we see that those people have higher levels of purpose in life, have larger, healthier hippocampal volumes. And this is true after adjusting for age and sex and race and educational attainment and the time lag between when we asked the questions about purpose and they got their MRI, and also adjusting for head size, because if you have a bigger head, you have a bigger space within the skull, you probably have a larger brain, and a larger brain, you probably have a larger hippocampus. So we adjust for kind of overall brain capacity, let's say. And one of the surprising things here was when we first looked at this, I predicted that we'd see a relationship where there'd be what we call an interaction between purpose and aging, where we really see the effect of purpose on hippocampal volume showing up as people get older. But we did not find an interaction. Instead, we found a main effect. So those people who had reported higher levels of purpose in life have larger hippocampal volumes across the entire adult age range, which is really, really interesting when you think about this measure of brain health. So feeling more purpose is associated with larger hippocampal volumes across adulthood. And we looked at other aspects of brain microstructure using some advanced magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI methods, such as diffusion-weighted imaging. So diffusion-weighted imaging is a way of looking at how water is moving in the brain and how it moves and how it's restricted by tissue or axons and neurites is informative and can tell us about relative brain health and brain microstructure. And we looked at hippocampal microstructure using a bunch of these diffusion-weighted imaging measures. We saw across models and across measures a consistent pattern suggesting better brain health in the hippocampus with those who have higher levels of purpose in life. They're reporting, for example, higher neurite density index, which is suggesting more complex, healthier microstructure. And again, we didn't see an interaction with age. What we see is that the pattern we see with purpose in life is opposite from what you see with aging. We then extended to look outside the hippocampus to the brain's white matter that connects parts of cortex and subcortical structures and basically facilitates communication across the brain. And we saw similar findings where those people at higher levels of purpose had different diffusion-weighted imaging measures that suggest healthier microstructure. And these relationships we see are the opposite of what we see with aging. Now we've recently looked at the brain's gray matter, the cortex around the brain. And this was one of the most, for me, mind-blowing findings that I've ever had in my lab, where we saw that across the brain's gray matter, those people who had higher levels of purpose in life across adulthood age ranges showed the same relationship across all cortex, basically healthier microstructure. But when we correct for all the different comparisons across the brain and how many voxels we separate the brain into, what came out was dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We see clear relationships that there's higher neurite density and orientation dispersion, more gray matter, and lower cerebral spinal fluid or atrophy in this brain region with purpose in life. And this is pretty profound because neurite density suggests a higher density of myelinated axons in this gray matter region, and orientation dispersion suggests more heterogeneity of neurite fiber orientations or dendritic arborization in the gray matter. So really kind of a stronger, richer, more complex microstructure in this part of the prefrontal cortex. And why this is so mind-blowing to us is because if we were to theorize before doing this research, what part of the brain would be really critical or involved in purpose in life, we would have predicted this part of prefrontal cortex. This part of prefrontal cortex is really critical for goal-directed behavior. This is the part of the brain that when people think about executive function, cognitive control, goal-directed behaviors, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is critical for it. And the fact that we see this relationship, again, not an interaction with age, but a main effect, even when you adjust for age and sex and race and educational attainment, you see feeling more purpose in midlife and older adulthood seems to be reflected by and or supported by greater structural integrity of this part of prefrontal cortex. Now, there's a lot there we don't know because this is all cross-sectional. We don't know, is this something where feeling more purpose, working in more meanings somehow kind of exercises this part of the brain to make it healthier and grow more complex microstructure? Or is it that you might be somebody just lucky enough to be born with it? Sorry, I didn't mean to advance it yet. We really need to tease it apart to look at kind of causal relationships with longitudinal follow-ups. But this kind of advanced neuroimaging measures have been added relatively recently in our MIDAS data collection. So it's only with additional follow-ups or a sample that we can kind of try to tease apart what's driving what. However, we have had longitudinal measures of purpose in life and psychological well-being in our MIDAS samples for multiple assessments that have resulted in some really kind of profound findings that were published just last year. So following up the sample who have repeated assessments, almost 7,000 people, who were 25 to 74 at baseline, across a 20-year period, there is a really important finding that those with a high school education or less showed persistently lower levels of psychological well-being, including purpose in life, than those with more education across time. So that's an important factor to consider. Education is protective, again, for purpose in life, psychological well-being, but also many aspects of brain health, and other aspects of health, well-being, and longevity. But then just looking at purpose in life and how it changed across age, there was a decline in all age groups over that 20-year period. And this is what's highlighted in the yellow. So a lot of people are looking at and testing interventions, for example, to see how we can really prevent that decline, that age-related decline in purpose in life. But it's also important to know that not everybody shows declines. That's an overall average finding across a sample that's almost 7,000 people. But there are a lot of people who actually maintain well-being or increase it, and understanding some of the factors that that's related to is also really important. So if we look at the people who are healthy enough, willing, and able to come to Madison from around the nation by plane, automobile, they'd come here from all over, from Florida to LA to even Alaska. We see a lot of differences, what we would call individual differences in people's purpose in life and how it changed from our MIDAS second to MIDAS 3 follow-up. So the people who are in blue, they showed declines over that roughly 10-year period. But the people who are in red showed actual increases in their purpose in life over a 10-year period. So there's variability in the sample that can help us learn what promotes perhaps maintaining purpose, but also what maintaining purpose may protect against. And in one study that's currently under review, we looked at resting functional activity in the brain, or what people call resting state fMRI or task-free fMRI. So this is when people are undergoing an MRI scan. They're awake, but they are not doing a task. And we can divide up their brain into cubes that we call voxels and look at their functional activity in the brain over time. And we can specifically look at, for example, the hippocampus here in yellow. That's our region of interest, and look at their functional connectivity in their hippocampus, what's going on in their fMRI data, and correlate that with other brain regions across the cortex and subcortical structures, and see what parts of the brain are having signal that suggests they're communicating and talking to each other. That's that functional connectivity. And then once we define that hippocampal functional connectivity with other parts of the brain, we can see how that varies with other kinds of predictors, such as age. And what we see is that with age increases, as people, we look across our sample, those people who are older show less hippocampal functional connectivity in the regions that are blue here in the brain. And that was a pretty large finding. These hippocampal functional connectivity decreases that are negatively associated with age. Only one part of medial prefrontal cortex in yellow showed an increase or more hippocampal functional connectivity with age. But when we look at this overall age relationship and how it varies with purpose in life, those people who had higher levels of purpose in life across that 10-year period, who maintained it or even increased their purpose in life, showed less of this age-related difference in hippocampal functional connectivity, suggesting that higher levels of purpose in life may protect against some of the changes in how the hippocampus is communicating with other parts of the brain with aging. So in summary, we see from a host of findings just in our MIDAS samples that higher levels of purpose in life are associated with brain health, larger hippocampal volumes across adulthood, healthier hippocampal white matter and dorsolateral prefrontal cortical microstructure, and better maintained functional connectivity with the hippocampus and other parts of the brain that are less reflective of typical age-related differences. Now, there are obvious limitations because right now the findings are very much cross-sectional. We don't have repeated measures until we're collecting them right now of the imaging measures that are more advanced. So we don't know, does purpose in life promote healthier brain microstructure, or do healthier brains allow for feeling more purpose? We also have to ask and want to know, do the health and lifestyle factors that have been associated with purpose mediate the better brain health? For example, better sleep, better, healthier diets, more exercise, more social and cognitive engagement. Or does, actually better brain health help people to do all those things? And our findings are in adulthood, from a large age range, 25 to almost 100. But what I would be really curious in, having a son who I want to promote brain health and purpose in life, do children and adolescents exhibit similar relationships between purpose and brain microstructure and functional connectivity? And there are people, researchers, who are testing and developing interventions to promote purpose in life in adolescents, in college students, especially, for example, for people who were impacted by the pandemic and remote school and impacts to their social lives. So there's more to do, in other words, to better understand, are these things that develop with adolescence or through childhood? Or could it be something as shocking as you're lucky enough to be born with a really complex dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for brain geeks like me? So you might have an intuition already in terms of what impacts purpose, such as experiences of the pandemic and some of the isolation that people experienced. But life transitions are often when most people feel kind of a change in their purpose, whether it's job burnout or loss of a job, or a new empty nest as people leave and grow up, retirement, losing a partner. On the flip side, having a child or a grandchild and other kinds of factors can really kind of promote and focus your purpose in life. When I had my son, I felt my purpose narrow in to really focus in on him and wanting to give him the best start I could to his life. So a lot of purpose is really tied up with being needed, or no longer being needed. So when you think about if you want to concentrate and find purpose or increase your purpose and meaning in life, there are some questions you can ask that have come out from different researchers' work and from different groups, such as the Greater Good group who are at Berkeley. Harvard Health has developed a series of questions, and I'm going to share them with you. So you can think about, for example, what are your strengths? You can ask your friends, your family, think about it yourself, partner, and what comes to mind when they think about you? Do they think you are entertaining or compassionate, artistic, or have some really well-defined, useful skills? You can think of ways that feedback can apply your attributes in a way that could give you meaning to your life and maybe even the lives of others. A lot of people find meaning through creative pursuits, making music, performing art, teaching people. But you might have other skills, carpentry, cooking, you name it. You can also think about what obstacles or adversity you've overcome in your life and what you learn from them. And that may be really helpful, insightful for others who are experiencing similar obstacles or adversity. Helping them, sharing your wisdom, helping people cope can really provide a lot of purpose and meaning in life. Another question to ask yourself is to actually think about how purpose has changed over your lifeline. So people actually draw up a timeline and think about how their purpose has changed as they age and what it was at different points of your life. For example, when you were an adolescent or in your early 20s, or started a family, how your family changed and grew up into older adulthood, and thinking about how where you were focused on, what was giving you purpose and meaning in life, and how it has transitioned as you've gone through different life stages may help you in your current life stage or even in the future. Another source is to look at who are your role models. And if there's somebody whose work you admire or contributions in your community, think about, can you do something similar? Use them as examples to follow. Also think about mentoring and sharing your knowledge and skills with others. Becoming a mentor is a really profound way to find purpose. People often think about the encouragement and wisdom they've gotten from others over the course of their lifespan, and being able to then pass it on to the next generation, or again, kind of reciprocate, is a really important way of getting purpose. And some of those reciprocal caring relationships are what impacts people as they get older. So if you can find new ways to kind of continue that on, that can really help. Then you can think about what the world needs and what causes are important to you and how you can help. It can be on a grand scale or a much smaller scale, from rescuing one animal in distress to thinking about world hunger and climate change, injustice. And you can identify a cause that's meaningful to you and think about ways you could help. Doesn't have to be grandiose, doesn't have to be where you're solving such major issues, but even improving one person's life, be it a cat or a person in your community, is meaningful. And there are people out there and communities and causes that could use probably your skills. So finding purpose through volunteering and working on causes is very meaningful for a lot of people. You can also share your story with others. And again, this can be on a large stage or more intimate, focused for your close others. So think about what you would have asked your parents, grandparents, or other people who are important to you, if you could, and write down the answers to those questions, stories from your childhood and across your life, to share with your children and grandchildren or friends and others who you think may benefit from it. Now, kind of a really useful exercise is to write your own obituary. At any age, you can do this, and you can do it to really learn from it, learn about yourself. You can think about, what do you want to be remembered for? And if you write your obituary, there might be aspects of it that you learn from in terms of what is something that you want to achieve that you haven't achieved yet, and that you could actually work on, something that you'd be really proud of. So this might be a useful exercise to find purpose and direction and goals for the future. You can also think about if you won the lottery. So a lot of people would do different things if financial concerns were not standing in the way. But there may be ways to do some of that even without having, for example, the monetary windfall. For example, would you travel the world? Would you volunteer? Would you do other things if you had suddenly lots of money? And are there ways that you can do elements of it even without winning the lottery, for instance? For example, if you always wanted to travel to Asia, maybe you could sign up with a volunteer organization like the Peace Corps which doesn't have an age limit to take you to Asia. I know people who have traveled from country to country, essentially house sitting and animal sitting to allow them to experience different cultures and different sites while helping others. But it doesn't have to be travel. It could be volunteering in your community or other aspects that you might have held off thinking, I don't have time for it or I don't have money for it. But maybe a few hours in the week you can do, and it will help you find purpose and meaning in life. So these questions, you can find these questions and other ways of finding purpose and meaning in life online. These are adapted from Harvard Health, but there are many other groups who put out suggestions. Some are more informed by research than others. And you can ask these questions to kind of inform your own search for meaning and purpose. But you can also learn from others. A lot of people have been inspired by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. So, for example, reading his book may help you and inspire you to think about things differently, or even just help, for example, during a time of loss or transition, to find meaning even when it's hard. And finding meaning really can help you cope and overcome stress and adversity and get to the other side. So you can think about what gives you purpose and meaning in life and how you will use it to age healthier. And that may sound a little narcissistic, to age healthier, but know that a lot of this often benefits not just you, but the others who are around you. As you provide purpose and meaning in your life can actually transition, and it's often spreads. It helps everybody. So I want to thank you all for listening today to this presentation and tuning in. Clearly, you have already probably more purpose in terms of you tuned in to this webinar and we're interested in learning and growing. All of the work that I shared with you is done by many, many people. Obviously, 30 years, that's a lot of people who've contributed to it. I and my team pictured here are just one small part of it. And Midas is just one small study compared to all the studies collectively that have helped us learn about how purpose is really important in promoting resilience. And we cannot do the research without being funded, for example, by the National Institutes of Health and National Institute on Aging. So your tax dollars are paying for this research, and we appreciate that. We also, of course, have to acknowledge our participants. Imagine these Midas participants who have been traveling to Madison, answering lots of questions, giving us their time, energy, pictures of their brain, but also their bodily fluids for decades and continue to do so. And we cannot ever express as much as we'd like to our gratitude to them. So thank you to everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Schaefer. That was an excellent presentation. We will have time in just a couple minutes for Q&A. I'm just going to share a couple slides. So if you do have any questions, please enter those into the chat. When you exit Zoom or out of Zoom today, you will be asked to provide your thoughts on a brief evaluation. So please be sure to do that. And if you did find this information or this presentation helpful, we would greatly appreciate a donation to help support the Age Well series. You can find that information on our website under the Give button. While there, we also recommend that you check out our upcoming workshops under the Find a Workshop on our website. So we do offer many evidence-based programs, and you can find all of that information there. And our next events in the Age Well series include food, fluids, and fall prevention happening on July 30th at 10 a.m., as well as hearing health, what everyone should know about hearing, hearing aids, and healthy aging on August 25th. So information to register for those two events and any upcoming events can be found also on our website or on the information or on the email that will be going out probably tomorrow with the recording from today's event. We also want to take a brief second to thank our sponsors, the Greater Wisconsin Agency on Aging Resources, And now we will open it up for Q&A. So I'll take a look at the chat here, but if anyone also wants to come off of mute, you are welcome to do that. So it looks like there's one comment. Thanks for the wonderful presentation and congrats on the work that you have done and are doing. Can you comment further on the potential for physical activity to be a potential major confounder? Physical activity is associated with higher purpose, more education, better sleep quality, greater hippocampal volume, better cognitive function, memory and executive function, and better hippocampal function connectivity. The bodies of these physical activity research literature are quite large.
I completely agree with everything you said. So I don't think it's necessarily a confounder, but potentially a mediator. So you are completely right that physical activity is associated with higher purpose, more education, but in all better sleep quality, a larger hippocampal volume. And you can actually see changes. And for example, in the hippocampus is one of the most neuroplastic regions. And physical activity, more exercise has profound changes on the hippocampus. So I don't think of it as a confounder, it's probably part of the relationships. But yes, it's something we need to test to see whether the relationships we see, if we look at, for example, mediation pathways, is it that purpose leads to greater exercise, leads to healthier brains, or does purpose lead to healthier brains that allow people to engage in more physical activity? Those kind of pathways, we don't know yet. All we know are these associations. So I think we're going to always have probably interconnections both ways. So that physical activity contributes to people being healthier all around in their brains, in their cognition, in their mood. It's a way of coping and reducing stress and depression. So I don't think we'll ever have one exactly drives the other. They're all helpful. And not just physical activity. Sleep is critically important. And that's something to really concentrate and impacts all aspects of our lives. And as does diet. So when you think about all the pieces, diet, exercise, sleep, social activity, and social engagement, and social connection with others, purpose is interconnected with all of that. It's not the thing you should just target. If you want to be healthy, do it all as best you can.
Great. And there's a question, are there any ties to having a sense of purpose and reducing falls risks for seniors?
So I don't know. I would actually have to do a literature search after we get off to see whether there's been any direct links. But I would predict yes, because of what we just talked about in terms of physical activity and exercise. If people are engaging in more physical activity, it's going to inherently help their balance and other things that impact falls. And you may know, since you're working on this, that Wisconsin has the highest number of falls in the country. It's something that clearly is very important to think about in Wisconsin, and whether that's due to our ice, drinking history, or other aspects. I think, again, working on exercise, sleep, nutrition, social engagement, cognitive engagement, and of course, purpose, all of it will probably be helpful in terms of it's impacting healthy aging. It's going to probably reduce your risk for falls as well.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this point, although many thanks for this comprehensive workshop. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to come off of mute and ask or type those in the chat.
Hi, Dr. Schaefer. I have a question. I wonder just your thoughts or the data that you've looked at with regards to the association of reduced sense of purpose and hopelessness. And maybe like that, an increase, I think we've seen an increase in hopelessness, maybe in the state of the world. And so just kind of your thoughts on that.
Yes, there are links between depression, anxiety, poor mental health, and lower purpose, and loneliness in particular. And loneliness is something that really seems to be or has been put out as a new epidemic worldwide. And again, these are cross-sectional relationships that we see across the world, really, across studies, in terms of what is driving, what's the instigator? Is it having low purpose leads to more loneliness or vice versa? Can't really speak to that, but I do think that, again, working on the ways to promote your purpose and meaning may help reduce loneliness and the mental health symptoms, as well as promote other aspects of health. But again, those causal relationships, we really can't really speak to yet. Yeah, more work needs to be done where people are actually implementing interventions and following people up over time to see what, when you manipulate it, if you go in and purposely try to promote purpose, for instance, or other aspects of social engagement, physical activity, a lot of the interventions that people are designing for, healthy aging are kind of, they're not just doing one thing. They're trying to a scatter shot of promoting better health and aging through social connection and purpose and encouraging continuing growing and learning. So again, teasing the one factor, we may never be able to do, but that's not necessarily the worst thing, because truth is, if we work on all of these factors, it will have probably a much more profound impact. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Great. Any other questions?
I thought this talk was really beneficial, and I feel like I learned a lot from it. So, working as an acute care physical therapist, now I'm just trying to think of, like, on a day-to-day basis, how I can, like, promote, like, finding purpose or focusing on purpose in my physical therapy sessions, like, day-to-day, to help those patients in the hospital to, like, get better or find that motivation. Because sometimes, especially with our patients that have been there for a month, it's really hard to find that purpose when you're in those four walls. So if you have any advice to speak to that, that would be great.
I have to admit that's outside my area of expertise, but I think I would think about some of the questions out there from Harvard Health and others, to ask your patients, what are they looking forward to? What are some of their long-term goals? How can improving their physical activity, or what you're working on in terms of their physical therapy, what's something they want to accomplish, and how can that motivate them? And perhaps even think about some of their past experiences that they've been proud of, whether they can try to do that again. There might be other ways to think about some of the questions that people pose in terms of finding purpose and meaning that you can kind of tap into and ask people, in your sessions in a nice discussion way. But that would be my suggestion and the way I try to go.
I like that. Thank you. It's definitely food for thought.
Thank you.
Dr. Schaefer, you kind of touched on those questions a couple of times. Is there a preferred method or way for someone to kind of frame their purpose when they're thinking about that?
I don't think so. So at least not that we know of. So it could be very variable. The questions that we ask, for instance, they're not getting at, are you a do-gooder? It could be that your purpose in life is making a lot of money, or other ways of obtaining power. And there are some people who are starting to examine whether is your purpose more pro-social or not, and whether that has an impact. But right now, it's really just, do you have purpose and meaning in life? And some of it can be really huge, like say you want to change the world in some way. But it can also be really simple, like basically giving your family the best environment they can, having, getting up, I'm going to have a clean house, I'm going to cook them healthy food, take my dogs for a walk. And it doesn't have to even be so huge, but just I have, for example, a lot of people who are older have a smaller group than they used to. The family may no longer be living with them. But this is where some of the having animals can be really helpful in terms of having purpose means you have to stick around the next day to provide for that animal rather than leave them alone. And going for a walk provides that physical activity with, for example, a dog, but also caring for animals and providing that love and care can provide meaning and purpose. So what I'm trying to get at is that it can really range in terms of, how big and impactful from the world and the community to small focused, and that you can still have purpose and meaning in life. In Wisconsin, there are a lot of people who care about our environment and promoting that. And for one example is native plants. People are, planting native plants to provide for insects and birds and wildlife. And that can provide a sense of meaning and purpose to expand the amount of your yard that's no longer lawn, but native plants. Clearly, I have a bias, which is why I'm sharing that perspective. But that I'm trying to get at is that it's just there's a lot of individual differences, and think about what means something to you.
Okay. Any other questions? I know we have a couple watch parties too. We'd welcome questions from those watch parties. I'll give it just a minute here. Any final thoughts from you, Dr. Schaefer?
Just want to say thank you to everybody who listened and asked questions, who are trying to help others, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. We really appreciate you, Dr. Schaefer, for joining us today and giving such an excellent presentation. Take care, everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye.